Welcome back to the channel. And if you are new here, you have arrived on exactly the right night, because the story we are about to tell is one of those rare ones that stays with you long after the last word fades. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, because this is a complete journey from the very first prayer to the very last revelation, and you are going to want to experience every single second of it. If supernatural romance with ancient power, impossible faith, and a love that defies 5 centuries of silence is your kind of story, hit that like button right now and let us dive in together. The town of Ashvale sat at the base of the Greymoor Mountains like something the world had half forgotten. A cluster of stone buildings and winding streets where the fog rolled in every evening and never quite left before morning arrived. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's designation before they knew their name, where alphas owned the businesses along the main road, and betas managed the schools and the councils and all the respectable middle spaces, and where omegas like Seraphine Voss lived in the narrower streets, took the lower-paying work, and learned very early that the social order of Ashvale was not something you questioned unless you wanted to spend the rest of your life even more invisible than you already were. Seraphine had grown up understanding this with the particular clarity that only comes from being reminded of it, constantly, from the way shop owners watched her when she came in to browse, from the way alpha children had been warned not to play too close to omega children in the schoolyard, from the way her own mother had whispered to her the night before her first day of school that the best thing an omega girl could do was be quiet, be useful, and be grateful for whatever space she was allowed to occupy. Her mother had not been a cruel woman. She had simply been a woman who had been broken by the same system and had no language left for anything other than its rules. Seraphine had never fully broken, but she had bent, the way all living things bend under enough weight, and by the time she was 23 years old, she had settled into a life that most people in Ashvale would have called appropriate for someone of her designation. She worked at the herbalist shop on Millstone Lane, grinding dried roots and measuring tinctures for the elderly beta woman who owned the place, and who was, in the Yao, small kindnesses she offered without ceremony. The closest thing to a mentor Seraphine had ever known. She lived in a one-room apartment above a bakery, and the smell of bread rising every morning was the most reliable comfort she had. She had few friends, not because she was unfriendly, but because genuine friendship requires a kind of mutual recognition that is very difficult to sustain across designation lines in a town like Ashvale. And she had long since stopped reaching across those lines, only to find that the other person could not quite see her clearly enough to reach back. She was not unhappy in a dramatic or despairing way. She was unhappy the way a room is dim when the curtains are drawn. A steady, ordinary absence of light that becomes so familiar, you stop noticing that things could be brighter. But every night, without exception, Seraphine climbed the hill. The Santuario, as the oldest residents still called it using the word from some older tongue that had been mostly lost, was a ruin on the eastern ridge above Ashvale, a circle of standing stones around a crumbled altar, half swallowed by moss and the roots of ancient trees that had grown up through the cracks over centuries of neglect. Most people in town did not think about it at all. The children who were old enough to go up there on dares had decided it was merely atmospheric and not actually frightening, and the adults dismissed it as a historical curiosity from an era when the pack's ancestors had apparently practiced some form of worship that modern werewolf society had entirely outgrown. The official history of Ashvale, the kind taught in schools and printed in the thin commemorative booklets sold at the town's annual festival, made no mention of what the sanctuary had once been for. It mentioned only that it predated the current civic structure and had at some point fallen out of use. This was, Seraphine had always felt, a remarkable amount of nothing to say about a place that still made the air feel different, heavier and more alive, the moment you stepped inside the stone circle. She had first gone up there when she was 9 years old, following a story fragment she had overheard her grandmother telling in the kitchen late at night. Something about a god who had walked among wolves before the councils existed. A being of ancient silver light who had believed that every wolf, regardless of designation, carried the same worth and the same sacred fire. Her grandmother had stopped talking when she noticed Seraphine in the doorway, and had never spoken of it again, and when Seraphine had tried to find the story in any book in the school library, she had found nothing, not a single page, not a single footnote. The absence itself had felt like information. You do not erase something from history unless it threatens something in the present. You do not scrub a name from every record unless that name still has power. 9-year-old Seraphine had understood this with a certainty that lived below words, in the part of her that had not yet been fully trained out of trusting itself, and she had climbed the hill for the first time that very afternoon, and stood inside the stone circle, and felt the difference in the air, and decided, with the absolute conviction of a child who has not yet learned that conviction is supposed to be earned, that whoever had been worshipped here deserved to be remembered. She had been going back every night since. The prayers she offered were not the formal structured supplications used in the designation temples in the center of town, the ones where alphas gathered on first days to give thanks for their strength, and betas gave thanks for their balance, and omegas were technically permitted to attend, but were seated in the back rows and were not asked to speak. Seraphine's prayers were conversations, long and sometimes rambling and always honest, spoken quietly into the moss-covered stones, while the fog moved around her and the mountains stood dark and enormous against the sky. She told the unknown god about her day. She told him about the customers who came into the herbalist shop, and the ones who talked over her, and the ones who occasionally, surprisingly, looked directly at her and asked her opinion as though it mattered. She told him about the book she was reading, and the dream she had had, and the small injustice she had witnessed on the street that morning that she had not had the power or the position to do anything about. She told him she believed he had been real, and that she was sorry the world had forgotten him, and that she thought the forgetting was not an accident, but a crime. She told him that she kept coming back because the silence here was different from the silence everywhere else, and that different silence felt like company, and that she needed company even if it was the ghost of something that might never have existed at all. For 14 years, the silence stayed silence, until the night of the autumn equinox, when Seraphine was 23 years old, and the fog was thicker than usual, and she had just witnessed her manager, the kind beta woman she respected, be spoken to dismissively by the new alpha landlord raising the shop's rent. And she had come to the stones angrier than she usually allowed herself to be, and she had knelt at the crumbled altar and pressed her palms flat against the cold carved surface, and said, out loud, and without ceremony, that she was tired of watching a world that punished goodness and rewarded cruelty, and that if there was any power left in this place at all, if anything of who he had been was still here, she needed to know it. She needed some sign that faith was not just an elaborate way of talking to yourself in the dark. The words had barely left her when the stone beneath her hands went warm, not body temperature warm, not the ambient warmth of stone that had been absorbing the day's heat, because the day had been cold, and the stones had been ice under her fingers a moment before. This was a warmth with intention in it, a warmth that pressed back against her palms, the way a living thing presses back when you place your hand against it, and the air inside the circle changed so suddenly and so completely that Seraphine's breath stopped mid-exhale, and she did not move, did not blink, did not think, simply existed in the arrested moment of something enormous, shifting from impossible to actual. The fog did not part. Dramatically. The stones did not glow. There was no thunder or spectacle. There was only that warmth beneath her hands. And then, for the first time in 14 years of talking into silence, a voice. It was not a sound, the way sound is usually a sound. It did not travel through air and arrive at her ears with any of the ordinary mechanics of voice. It was more as though the stones themselves were vibrating at a frequency that her body could translate. And the translation arrived not as noise, but as meaning, as the shape of words forming directly in the part of her mind that recognizes language, deep and resonant and threaded through with something she could only describe afterward, as the specific quality of something that has been waiting for a very long time. The voice said, with a slowness that felt like a thing unfolding after centuries of compression, that she had been heard, that she had always been heard, and that it had taken this long not because it had not wanted to. Answer, but because the seal had allowed only the thinnest thread of connection, and it had been waiting for a night when her faith and her anger and her presence were strong enough to widen that thread even slightly, and that her name, the voice said, her name had a particular sound in the space where he had been held for 500 years, a sound like the word for someone who has kept a fire burning in an empty house, and he had been grateful for it every single night. Seraphine sat back from the altar, and her hands were shaking, and her eyes were full of tears she did not entirely understand. And she said, in a voice considerably less steady than she would have liked, that she needed him to say something else because she needed to know this was real and not a breakdown. The presence, which had not yet told her his name, said that she smelled like yarrow and old paper, and something he did not have a word for in any language of the current era, something that translated most closely as the thing that stays when everything else leaves. He said that the stone altar had a crack in the lower left corner in the shape of a running wolf that had been carved there deliberately by the first pack who built this place, and that no one in 5 centuries of occasional visitors had ever looked closely enough to notice it. Seraphine, who had been sitting at this altar for 14 years, scrambled to look, and there it was, the crack she had always seen as purely structural. And now that she was looking for it with new eyes, she could see that it was not random at all. It was a shape, 4 legs mid-stride, and a tail streaming behind, and a head turned slightly as though the wolf were looking back over its shoulder. She pressed her finger into the carved groove and wept, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of finding out that something you have believed in the face of all evidence was not, in fact, a delusion. She asked him what to call him. He said his name had been used as a weapon against him once, stripped from the record so that no one could invoke it and no one could call him back, but that she could use the name her grandmother had known, the fragment of the old story that had sent a 9-year-old girl up a hill for the first time. He said, "Call me Kael'thar. If you are watching this right now and you feel that recognition in your chest, that this is exactly the kind of story you have been looking for, please take a second to leave a comment below telling me your favorite detail so far, because your engagement genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love stories like this one, and we are only just beginning." The weeks that followed that first night were the most disorienting and the most alive that Seraphine had ever felt simultaneously. During the day, she went through the ordinary architecture of her life, the herbalist shop, the narrow streets, the apartment above the bakery, and she moved through all of it with the slightly unreal quality of someone keeping a tremendous secret, which she was. She told no one. There was no one to tell, and beyond that, she understood instinctively that the connection she had found at the sanctuary was fragile in ways she did not yet fully understand. A thread through a seal that centuries of deliberate imprisonment had made rigid, and that the wrong attention at the wrong moment might snap it. She was also aware, with a practical clarity she appreciated about herself, that telling anyone, in Asheville, that she had been having nightly conversations with the spirit of a god who had been imprisoned by the founding powers of werewolf society would result in outcomes ranging from genuine concern for her mental health to something considerably more hostile from the people with reasons to want that particular god to stay forgotten. So she climbed the hill every night and sat at the altar and talked with Kael'thar. And the conversations deepened the way the best conversations do, not through grand revelations, but through accumulation, through the steady building of understanding that comes from 2 minds meeting each other honestly over time. Kael'thar's situation, as she came to understand it, was layered in ways that the word imprisoned did not adequately capture. He was not unconscious or unaware. He existed in a space that overlapped with the physical world, but was sealed from it by the enchantment placed on him by the Council of 7, the governing body of werewolf society 5 centuries ago, whose descendants still held power in the current council structure. He could perceive the world through thin points in the seal, places where old magic was close to the surface, which was why the sanctuary had been his clearest window. He had watched Asheville change over the centuries, and had watched the social order he had given his existence to opposing become more entrenched and more sophisticated in its cruelty. He had watched the designation system calcify from a fluid set of tendencies into a rigid legal and social hierarchy. And he had watched the people on the margins of that system, omegas and unbonded betas, and the occasionally born wolf, who did not fit neatly into any category, find ways to survive inside the walls built around them. And he had been unable to do anything except watch. He told Seraphine this without bitterness, which she found remarkable. She asked him about it directly one night, sitting cross-legged on the cold ground with her palms against the altar stone and the mountains black against a sky full of stars. She said, 500 years of watching everything you tried to build get dismantled, and you do not sound angry. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that anger had not been a useful emotion inside the seal, that he had had a great deal of time to work through what anger had to offer, and come out the other side of it into something that he could only describe as a very long, very patient grief that had eventually transformed into something that felt more like purpose. He said that he had not been ready to speak to anyone who came to the sanctuary for most of those 5 centuries, because the seal had been too complete, and because he had learned that some of the people who came were descendants of the very families who had imprisoned him, and he had not trusted himself to speak to them without desperation or rage coloring what he said. He said that when Seraphine had started coming, when she had been 9 years old and furious and faithful in the same breath, something had shifted. He said that he had been listening to her for 14 years, and that he knew what she was made of, and that it was not quite the same as knowing her the way 2 people know each other when both of them can be present in the same space. But it was not nothing either. Seraphine thought about this for a long time before she said what she said next. She said, "You have been learning me for 14 years, and I did not know it." She said, "That is either the most intimate thing anyone has ever told me, or it should be alarming," and she was not entirely sure which one it was. Kelthar said, and there was something in the vibration of the words that she was beginning to recognize as the quality of a smile expressed through stone rather than face, that he thought it was probably both simultaneously, and that he had chosen to tell her because she deserved the honesty of it, and that if she wanted him to describe exactly what he had learned, he would do so, and that she could decide for herself whether it felt like intimacy or intrusion. She said, "Tell me." He told her that she made decisions slowly and never impulsively, which was not caution, but rather a thoroughness, because she could not rest with a half-examined choice. He told her that she was kinder to strangers than to herself, that she could identify the systemic sources of other people's pain with precision, but tended to accept her own circumstances with a resignation she would never apply to someone else in her situation. He told her that she was very funny in a way she did not know was funny, that her descriptions of ordinary events carried a dry and exact observation of human absurdity that he had found himself looking forward to every night. He told her that the thing that had impressed him most in 14 years of listening was not her faith, though her faith was extraordinary, but her unwillingness to perform faith. She had never once, in all those years, come to the sanctuary to be seen or to demonstrate devotion. She had come because she believed, and she had kept believing in the face of total silence, and that was a different and rarer thing entirely. Seraphine pressed her forehead against the altar stone for a long moment after that, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been deflection. She said finally, quietly, that she had not known anyone was listening. He said, "I know. That is exactly why I was." The connection between them strengthened as the weeks turned toward winter, and with the strengthening came new information that changed the shape of everything Seraphine thought she understood about her own life. Kelthar had been imprisoned by 7 council members, using an enchantment that required 7 bloodlines to hold. The seal was anchored to the descendants of those 7 families, who had been told, in the version of events passed down through their lineages, that the seal had been placed on a dangerous and destabilizing spirit who had sought to overturn the natural order, and that they were the guardians of that containment. Some of them believed this sincerely. Some of them, Kelthar suspected, knew it for the political architecture it was, and maintained it anyway, because the natural order it protected happened to benefit them enormously. The seal could be broken only if all 7 anchors were confronted with the truth and chose to release their hold, or if the bloodline of the original high priestess of Kelthar's sanctuary, The woman who had facilitated his imprisonment as the seventh and final seal chose to renounce her family's role and speak the words of release. Seraphine had been very still when he told her this. She had known, somewhere below knowing, that her presence here was not coincidental. She had felt the particular weight of the sanctuary's air differently from everyone else she had ever seen come up the hill. The occasional curious teenager, or the local historian who had visited once and taken photographs and never returned. She had understood without words that this place had chosen her back in some way she could not articulate. But understanding the mechanism was different from the understanding she had been carrying, and she sat with the stillness of it for a long time before she asked the question she needed to ask. She asked if her grandmother had known. He said, yes. She asked if her grandmother had come to the sanctuary. He said, for 40 years, before her health made the climb impossible. He said that her grandmother had been the one to tell him, through the stones, about a little girl who was growing up asking questions that the town did not want answered, and that her grandmother had died believing that Seraphine would be the one to finish what she had spent her life not quite daring to begin. He said that he was telling her this not as pressure, but as context, because she deserved the whole story rather than a partial one, and because whatever she chose to do with this knowledge was entirely her decision, and he would respect any choice she made, including the choice to walk away from all of it. Seraphine thought about her grandmother, who had smelled like dried lavender and always wore her silver hair in a complicated braid, who had told her half a story in a kitchen late at night, and then taken the rest of it to her grave. She thought about a woman carrying the knowledge of what her bloodline had done for an entire lifetime, unable to undo it but also unable to fully leave it behind, climbing a hill for 40 years and talking into stones and hoping. She thought about the specific grief of that, the arc of it, the way some burdens are passed down not through malice, but through incompletion, one generation unable to finish the work handing it forward to the next. She told Kelthar that she was not walking away. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I know. I have known for a long time, but I needed you to say it freely. This is the part of the story where most people would expect a training sequence, a period of Seraphine learning to control hidden powers and discovering the full scope of her bloodline's abilities, and there was some of that. But what Kelthar gave her first was not training. What he gave her first was information, because he had been imprisoned by people who used ignorance as a containment strategy, and he was not going to participate in that approach with someone he was asking for help. He told her everything. He told her the real history of Ashvale, the history that had been removed from the school books and the commemorative pamphlets, the history in which the designation system had not been a natural social evolution, but a deliberate political construction, instituted over 3 generations by a coalition of alpha families who had systematically dismantled the older council structure that Kelthar had helped build and replaced it with one that concentrated power in the highest designation tier. He told her about the original pack law that had recognized all designations as equal expressions of wolf nature and had distributed power according to demonstrated wisdom rather than inherited biology, and about how that law had been argued away, and then voted away, and then ultimately suppressed away as the coalition grew strong enough that opposition became dangerous. He told her about the 7 families, who they had been, and who their descendants now were, and some of those names landed in Seraphine's chest with a particular weight because she knew them. They were the council members, and the business owners, and the old money families who ran Ashvale's civic life, the people who were simply the powerful in her current understanding of the world, and who, with this new information, became something more specific and more accountable than the generic category of the powerful had allowed them to be. Please, if you have a friend who loves supernatural romance and stories about history being rewritten and power being confronted with truth, share this video with them right now. This story is built for the kind of person who feels things deeply and believes that fiction can tell true things, and those people deserve to find it. Learning to use her bloodline's abilities was a slower and stranger process than Seraphine had expected, partly because the abilities were not what she would have anticipated, and partly because Kelthar's approach to teaching them was unlike anything she had imagined. She had expected something dramatic, a rush of sudden power, silver light and transformation. and the discovery of fighting abilities she had always secretly possessed. What she found instead was that the High Priestess bloodline carried something more subtle and in some ways more formidable, a capacity for what Kael'thar called deep truth perception, the ability to sense the full emotional and intentional reality behind what someone was saying, not telepathy exactly, but a kind of resonance reading that stripped performance and self-deception away from communication and left only what was actually true. He told her that the first High Priestess had developed this ability as the sacred mediator of the pack, the person all parties trusted to arbitrate disputes because she could not be deceived and could not deceive, and that it had been one of the main reasons the council had wanted her controlled and ultimately had used her family to seal Kael'thar away, because a being who valued truth so fundamentally and an ability that made truth unavoidable were both enormously threatening to people whose power depended on strategic versions of reality. Seraphine discovered that she had been using a muted version of this ability her entire life without understanding what it was. The sense she had always had that she could tell when someone was performing kindness versus genuinely offering it, that she could feel the specific quality of contempt underneath polite words, that she could walk into a room and understand within moments what the actual emotional dynamics were rather than the presented ones. All of this was not intuition in the ordinary sense. It was inheritance. And as Kael'thar helped her consciously engage with it, rather than simply receive it passively, it expanded into something considerably more precise and more powerful, a full awareness of the emotional truth of any interaction she was part of, delivered with a clarity that was sometimes uncomfortable and always accurate. She practiced on the customers in the herbalist shop, not manipulatively but observationally, beginning to understand the difference between someone who was rude because they were in pain and someone who was rude because they had never been required not to be, between the alpha who was dismissive because he genuinely believed omegas were lesser and the alpha who was dismissive because he was afraid of something he could not name. The distinctions mattered. They had always mattered to her on some level. Now she could read them with precision, and precision made her better at her work in ways that the elderly beta owner began to notice and quietly appreciate without fully understanding what had changed. She also discovered, more gradually, that the deep truth perception worked on the sanctuary stones themselves, that she could read the emotional imprints left on them by the people who had come here over centuries, a palimpsest of devotion and grief and anger and hope, layered so deeply into the rock that it was almost geological. She spent a night reading those layers with Kael'thar guiding her, and what she found confirmed everything he had told her about the history that had been erased. The stones remembered, the prayers of generations of omegas and betas, and every kind of wolf who had believed in a different way of being a pack were still there, pressed into the grain of the rock, a record that no council decision and no school curriculum revision could reach. She wept through most of that night, not from sadness, but from the weight of being the first person in generations to receive the full testimony, to know that all those voices had not disappeared but had simply been waiting in the stone for someone with the ability to read them. Kael'thar said nothing through most of it, simply held the warmth in the altar steady and let her have the grief and the responsibility of it. When she was done, he said, "Now you understand why I waited for someone with your bloodline. Anyone else could have been given the information, but only someone who could read the stones could fully receive it. Only you can know it in your body, rather than just your mind. And that knowing is what is going to matter when the time comes." Winter settled over Ashvale, and Seraphine climbed the hill in snow, her breath clouding in the cold air, her palms warm against stone that should have been frozen. The connection between her and Kael'thar had developed into something that she did not have adequate language for, because human languages, even the rich ones, tend to develop vocabulary for experiences that multiple people have simultaneously, and the experience of growing close to a being who existed between planes through the medium of ancient stone was sufficiently unusual that the available words were all inadequate approximations. She used them anyway. She said, once, on a particularly clear winter night when the stars were extraordinary above the mountains, that she thought about him during the day. He said he was aware of this, which would have been either comforting or unsettling depending on the framing. And she said that she had decided it was comforting. He said he thought about her too, in the sense that the thing he experienced in the sealed space could be called thinking, and that the quality of his attention during the daylight hours had changed significantly in the months since she had heard him for the first time. She asked how. He said, "Before, I watched the world through the thin places in the seal with the attention of someone waiting for conditions to change. Now I find myself following a single thread of light through the gray." She sat with that for a long time before she said that she needed him to know that she was aware of the power imbalance in whatever this was, that he had known her for 14 years, and she had known him for months, and that she was not afraid of the imbalance, but she wanted to name it because naming things accurately was something she valued. He said that he valued it too, and that the imbalance was real, and that she had his permission to ask anything she wanted in order to make it more even, and that he would answer with the same honesty she had always given him. She asked what he had been before the imprisonment. Not the high god of the stories, she said. She understood the mythology. She meant what he had been in the daily reality of himself. He was quiet for a while, and then he told her about a wolf who had loved the mountains and found the high places clarifying, who had been drawn to the marginal people in every pack, not from pity, but from genuine fascination with what people made of difficult circumstances, who had found council meetings exhausting but necessary, and always came to them having prepared more than anyone expected, who had loved, once, a woman of extraordinary courage who had died 3 centuries before the seal, who had been learning to live with that loss with varying degrees of success for the years between, who had made poor decisions under pressure and good ones under pressure, and was not entirely different from anyone else in the texture of his inner life, except for the ways in which existing for several thousand years before imprisonment gives a being a particular relationship to time and loss that is genuinely uncommon. Seraphine listened to all of this with her chin resting on her folded hands against the altar stone and said, "That is the most I have ever heard you say about yourself at once." He said, "You asked the right question. If this story is moving you the way I think it might be, this is a perfect moment to subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because we tell stories exactly like this one regularly, and you do not want to miss what is coming next." The crisis that forced the story into its next phase arrived in early spring, when the Council of Ashvale announced a new designation ordinance that would require all Omegas within the town limits to register their employment and living situations with the council office and submit to quarterly review, ostensibly for the purposes of community welfare assessment, but transparently, to anyone who could read the subtext, a mechanism for tightening control over the most economically and socially vulnerable population. The announcement was made with the language of care and community support, which was the most insidious kind of announcement because it made resistance sound like ingratitude. Several Omegas Seraphine knew had already been told by their employers that the registration process would require employer sign-off, effectively giving Alpha business owners a formal veto over their employees' housing and livelihood situations. Seraphine read the announcement 3 times and felt the slow, precise activation of something that her months of bloodline training had been building toward, a clarity of purpose that was not anger, though anger was present in it, but something colder and more useful than anger. The kind of clarity that comes when you understand exactly what a system is for and exactly what it will take to change it. She went to the sanctuary that night earlier than usual and told Kael'thar what had happened, and he was quiet for a long time before he said, "This is the kind of thing they have been building toward for 50 years, and it will not stop here if it is not stopped now." He said, "I think the time has come." She asked if she was ready, and he said, with the quality in the vibration that she knew now was not a smile, but something deeper, something like reverence, that she had been ready for longer than she knew. The process of confronting the 7 bloodlines was not going to be a dramatic confrontation in a single room. That was not how change of this kind worked, and both Seraphine and Kael'thar understood. What it required was something more demanding than drama. It required the patient and precise work of individual truth, going to each of the 7 families and giving them the actual history, not as an accusation, but as information, because deep truth perception worked in both directions. She could read them, and they could, if she used the ability correctly, receive from her the full weight and clarity of what she knew. She could not force anyone to believe her or to act on what they believed. She could only make the truth unavoidable and leave the choice to them. She started with the family she thought would be most receptive, a name Kael'thar had given her with the context that this line had produced at least 3 generations of members who had shown discomfort with the seal and had in one case attempted to research its origins, only to be shut down by the other 6 families. The current descendant was a woman named Mira Holst, a beta woman in her 60s who ran the local historical archive and who Seraphine had spoken to occasionally over the years in the herbalist shop, where she came for the particular tea blend that helped with her arthritis. Seraphine had always found her unusually direct and unusually curious for someone of her position, and now she understood the source of that unusual quality. It was the discomfort of someone who knew something was wrong and had not yet found the right framework for the knowledge. Seraphine went to the archive on a Tuesday morning and asked Mira Holst if she could speak with her privately about the sanctuary on the hill and the history it held, and watched the woman's face with her full, deep truth perception active, and saw, beneath the careful, neutral expression, a recognition so immediate and so old that it had its own specific texture, the texture of something a person has been half-consciously waiting to hear for a very long time. They spoke for 3 hours. Seraphine did not perform anything or construct anything. She simply told the truth, the full truth, including the parts about her own bloodline and her grandmother, and the 14 years of nightly prayers and what those prayers had eventually reached. She told Mira what the stones remembered. She described the emotional record she had read in the rock, the generations of voices, and she watched Mira Holst sit with the weight of that and feel what it weighed. When she was done, there was a long silence, and Mira said, in a voice that was entirely stripped of performance, that she had known something was wrong with the founding history since she was in her 20s, and had been told there were no records from before the current council structure. She said, "No society simply has no records from before a certain date. Records do not disappear by accident." She said, "I spent 30 years working in this archive trying to find the gap, and all I found was evidence that someone had been very careful about what they removed." Seraphine said, "The stones have everything." Mira Holst looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Take me up the hill." They went at dusk, and Seraphine put Mira's hands on the altar stone and helped her feel what was in it, guiding her the way Kael'thar had guided Seraphine, and she watched the archivist receive the record of her own bloodline's original act, the full truth of what had been sealed away and why, and she watched the woman weep and did not look away from it. Kael'thar was present, in the stone warmth, and said nothing, only witnessed. When Mira finally lifted her hands from the altar, her face had changed in the specific way that a person's face changes when a long-held tension releases, and she said, "What do I need to do?" Seraphine said, "Say the words of release when all 7 are ready, and help me reach the others." 6 months of work followed that evening. Mira became the first partner in what grew into a careful, painstaking project of individual truth-telling. Each confrontation different, because each of the 7 bloodlines had its own relationship with what had been done and what had been kept, its own layer of denial or discomfort or complicity that needed to be addressed honestly and without theater. 2 of the 7 families refused the first approach entirely and needed to be returned to, one of them twice, before the person in question could sit with the truth long enough to stop defending against it. One of the 7 was a man who knew exactly what his family had done and had made peace with it by deciding that the system it produced was good, and this was the hardest conversation of all. Not because he was hostile, but because his conviction was sincere and dismantling. A sincere conviction requires more precision and more patience than defeating hostility. Seraphine came to him 3 times with 3 different angles of the truth, each time reading his responses with full perception and finding the place where genuine doubt lived, underneath the conviction, and on the 3rd visit, she spoke directly to that doubt, and held it steady until it could become a question. And a question is all anyone needs in order to start. All of this was happening against the backdrop of the registration ordinance, which had passed and was now being implemented, and the effects of which Seraphine could see daily in the lines outside the council office, the faces of Omega women she knew standing in formal queues to have their lives evaluated and approved. The particular quality of indignity in being required to document your own existence for the benefit of people who would use the documentation against you if it suited them. She went to the sanctuary every night through all of it, and the conversations with Kael'thar were different now. Less the long patient learning of the early months, and more the specific planning of two people working toward something together. More equal in a way that was both practically necessary and privately meaningful, and she noticed that the warmth in the stone had a different quality when she was reporting a success, brighter and more present, and that when she described a day that had been hard, it steadied in a way that was unmistakably comfort rather than information. She said once in early autumn of the second year of this work, sitting against the altar stone instead of at it because she was tired and her back hurt and she had had an exhausting day, that she wanted to ask him something, and she was not sure he was going to like the question. He said, "Ask." She said, "When the seal is broken, what happens to you?" He said, "I come back." She said, "Back how?" He said that the restoration of his full presence would be gradual, that he would return to a physical form that was not quite what it had been, that 5 centuries in the seal changed a being in ways he had not fully mapped yet, and the return would require its own process of relearning. She said, "Will you still be you?" He was quiet, and then said, "I will be me, the way that something is still itself after a long and difficult journey, changed in the surface, but consistent in the core of what matters." He said, "I will still know what yarrow smells like, and how your grandmother used to come at dusk, and how you laugh when you think something is genuinely funny and not just socially funny." She said, her voice careful, "I need to tell you something." He said, "I know what you are going to say." She said, "I know you know. I am saying it anyway." She said, "I love you," in whatever way those words apply to something like this, in whatever incomplete and unprecedented way they fit our situation. "I love you." The stone went so warm under her back that she could feel it through her coat, and his voice said, "In whatever way love has ever meant anything, I have loved you since a 9-year-old girl pressed her palms against a cold stone and decided, alone and without evidence, that something worth loving had been here." The 7th meeting of the 7 bloodlines happened on an evening in late autumn, in the archive basement where Mira had set up the space, 6 of the 7 having agreed to come. The 7th having sent a written statement of release that Mira had validated as legally sufficient under the old pack law she had spent 2 years excavating from the hidden record the stones had shown her. They stood in a circle in the archive basement with the document of historical truth that Seraphine had written out from the stone's record on the table between them, and one by one, they spoke the words of release in their original form, old words in an old tongue that Kael'thar had taught Seraphine phonetically over months of nightly sessions, and she had taught them to the 6 who were present. Mira Holst spoke last, and when she finished the last syllable, the room went very still, and then the temperature dropped, and then rose sharply, and then settled, and the quality of the air changed in a way that Seraphine recognized immediately as the distinctive weight of that space being unlocked. She left the archive and walked through the dark town and up the hill, faster than she usually walked, not running but close to it. And when she stepped into the stone circle, the sanctuary was different in a way she felt in her entire body, the presence that had always lived in the stones there as it always had been, but louder, closer, no longer filtered through the seal's compression, the full weight and warmth of him present in the air itself, rather than requiring her palms on stone to reach. She stood in the center of the circle and said his name, and the response was not the vibration in the stone, but actual sound, a voice in the air, lower and more resonant than she had imagined it in her mind's translation of stone vibration. And it said her name, and she stood there for a long moment, just listening to the actual sound of her own name in his actual voice. The physical return took 3 days, which was 3 days of Seraphine camping at the sanctuary, with blankets and the portable camp stove she had brought without ceremony, sleeping against the altar stone and talking to a presence that was becoming more solid with each hour, a form condensing out of the charged air inside the circle, the way frost condenses on cold surfaces. Not dramatically, not with light shows or seismic events, just the steady and deliberate return of something that had been present here before the world forgot. On the third morning, she woke at dawn to find that she was not alone in the stone circle, in the way she had been alone for the previous 2.5 days. He was there, not yet fully substantial, his form still having a translucency that the dawn light passed through in ways that light does not pass through solid things, but present and shaped and real in the way that matters most, in the way that is about a person being there and not just a force. He was very tall, which she had somehow not expected, despite knowing intellectually that he was not human. He had silver white hair, and the kind of face that is made of clear angles, and long bones that read as strong, rather than handsome, though it was both, and his eyes were a gold gray that held something in them that did not look like human eyes, not because they were supernatural in color, but because they had 5 centuries of stillness in them, a depth of patience that no human life was long enough to accumulate. He looked at her, across the stone circle, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because the moment had its own weight and rushing, it would have been a kind of disrespect. He said, finally, in the voice she now recognized in its full form, "You look exactly as I imagined." She said, "That seems statistically improbable, given that you have not had a physical form for 500 years. He said, "I imagined carefully." She laughed, and the laugh startled her because it was the genuine, the kind that she had never learned to perform and only produced when something was actually funny, and he looked at her with an expression that was unmistakably someone recognizing something they had waited a long time to see in person, and said, "There it is." They stood in the stone circle as the dawn became morning, and the fog came up the mountain slope the way it always did, and the town of Ashvale woke below them, and Seraphine told him about everything that had happened in the nights. Since the seal broke that she had not been able to tell him in the way she had been telling him things for 2 years, because she had been too busy watching him return to say anything. She told him that the council had been formally petitioned with the historical document, that Mira Holst was leading the legal challenge to the registration ordinance, armed with the original pack law and the full historical record the stones had provided, that 3 of the 7 bloodlines had already announced their support publicly, and 2 more were expected to follow, that the town was unsettled and uncertain in the way towns get when the story they have told themselves about their own history becomes visibly insufficient, which was uncomfortable and important, and exactly where it needed to be. He listened to all of this the way he had always listened to her, with his full attention, and when she finished, he said that she had done more in 2 years than he had hoped for in 5, and she said that she had had a great deal of help from a very patient teacher. He said, "You did the work. I only remembered what you already were." The weeks after his return were a period of adjustment that Seraphine had expected to be awkward, and found instead to be surprisingly natural, which she suspected said something about 2 years of nightly conversation being a more thorough introduction than most relationships managed in twice that time through ordinary means. Kael'thar was learning his way back into physical existence with the particular attention he brought to everything, noting each sensation with a precision that she found alternately moving and funny, the weight of gravity and the smell of the bakery, 2 streets from her apartment and the way coffee tasted, and the specific quality of being cold, which he had not been capable of for 500 years, and which he described as unexpectedly valuable information about being a body. He stayed at the sanctuary initially, then gradually moved into more of the town as his form solidified, and his presence became less charged with the raw energy of recent reincorporation, and more simply the presence of a very unusual person being present in a place. She introduced him to Mira Holst, who shook his hand with tears in her eyes and said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of my bloodline that I do not have words adequate to," he said, with the particular steadiness she had come to understand, as not equanimity exactly, but the thing that lives on. The other side of genuine grief processed over a very long time. You chose differently when you had the chance. That is what matters. Mira wiped her eyes and said she was going to put that on a plaque in the archive, and he said, "Please do not." The social transformation in Ashvale was not quick, and was not clean, and was not the kind of thing that resolved into a triumphant moment, because social transformation rarely does. It moves in increments and reversals and partial victories and negotiations and the occasional exhausting step sideways, and Seraphine understood this and did not expect otherwise. What she could see was that the shape of the conversation had changed, that the registration ordinance was being legally challenged by a coalition that now had historical precedent behind it, that the council's ability to present the current hierarchy as natural and inevitable had been significantly complicated by the archive's release of the full historical record, that the voices of omegas and unbonded betas and everyone who lived on the system's margins were finding more hearing than they had found in several generations. It was not a revolution. It was the beginning of a long, necessary, imperfect reckoning, and that was real, and it was enough for now. What was also real, and also enough, and perhaps more than enough in the way that truly important things tend to be more than anything you adequately anticipated. On a night in late winter, Caelthar came to her apartment above the bakery the first time he had been there, and she had made tea in the way she always made tea because she needed something ordinary to do with her hands, while she adjusted to the reality of him filling the small space she had lived in alone for her entire adult life. He looked at her bookshelves and her dried herb bundles hanging from the ceiling, and the small carved wolf figure she had kept on her windowsill since her grandmother had given it to her at age 9, and he picked up the carving and held it with a gentleness that told her something about the specific weight of recognizing something you gave to someone's ancestor in a previous life and finding it still in the family, passed down through generations of women who had come up the hill. He put it back carefully and turned to look at her, and she thought, this is the moment. This ordinary kitchen moment with tea getting cold on the counter and the smell of tomorrow's bread already in the air. This is what we were moving toward across 5 centuries and 14 years of prayer. Not any single dramatic revelation, but this. The simplicity of 2 people in a small, warm room, looking at each other with nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. She said, "Are you staying?" He said, "If you are asking me to." She said, "I am asking you to." He crossed the small kitchen, and she did not step back, and he was still translucent enough in certain lights that she could see the window through him, which she chose to find endearing rather than alarming, and he placed his hands against her face, the way she had always placed her hands against the altar stone, with the same specific deliberateness, the same intention, and said her name in the voice she had fallen in love with through stone and vibration, before she ever heard it as sound. She leaned into his hands and said, "For the record, you also smell like yarrow." He said, "That is because you have been touching me with yarrow-scented hands for 2 years through a stone altar, and apparently it is permanent." She laughed, the real kind again, and his expression was everything she needed it to be. And if you are still watching, you already know that this is the kind of story that does not actually end here, because the work Seraphine and Caelthar began together in Ashvale spread in the way that true things spread, not through conquest, but through resonance, finding the other sanctuaries in other towns that held the same prayers pressed into their stones, finding the other descendants of the 7 bloodlines who had been waiting for someone to give them a reason to choose differently, finding the corners of the world where omegas had been quietly keeping their own fires burning in empty houses, and needing only to know that someone was listening. But that is a story for another night. Epilogue. 5 years after the seal broke, the registration ordinance had been struck down by a reformed council structure that now included equal representation from all designations. The change fought for and won through years of legal challenge and public record, and the kind of patient, grinding work that is much harder than heroism and much more effective. The sanctuary on the hill above Ashvale had been formally recognized as a heritage site by the new council, its real history documented and displayed in the archive and taught in the schools in a curriculum that Mira Holst had designed with characteristic precision and Seraphine had reviewed with her deep truth perception, and Kelthar had consulted on with the authority of someone who had been there. The standing stones had been stabilized, and the carved wolf on the altar had been carefully cleaned and documented. And there was almost always someone up there. Not tourists, but residents. People from all designations who came to sit inside the circle and feel the quality of the air and understand that this was a place that had held the memory of a different way of being a pack for 500 years, waiting. Seraphine still went every night. Old habits, she said, when people asked. Kelthar, who was now fully solid, and had been since the second year after his return, and who had a role in the new council as something that had no historical precedent, and therefore required the invention of a new title, came with her most nights. They sat in the stone circle with their backs against the altar, his shoulder against hers, and the mountains above and the town below, and the fog moving the way fog moves, purposefully, and without destination. On one of those nights, in the 5th year, Seraphine pressed her palms flat against the altar stone the way she always had, and she said, quietly and without ceremony, that she had something to tell whoever was listening. Kelthar, who was right beside her and was definitely listening, said nothing and waited. She said, "There is going to be someone else who will need to know the history and the words. Not yet, but someday." He was very still for a moment, and then he turned to look at her in the specific way that meant his full attention, all 5 centuries of it. And she watched his face do something that she had spent years cataloging and still found surprising in its capacity to be new. And he said, "The history." She said, "Yes." He said, "And the words?" She said, "Yes." He looked at the mountains for a long moment, and then at her, and said, "Then we had better make sure everything is written down properly." She said, "Mira is already on it." He said, "Of course she is." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him, actual body warmth now rather than the warmth of intention in cold stone, and the same quality of it was there, the quality that had stopped her breath the first night, the warmth that pressed back, the warmth of something that knew she was there and was glad of it. She said, "I talked to you for 14 years in the dark before you answered." He said, "I know." She said, "It was worth it." He put his arm around her, and the stone circle held them in its particular silence, and the town lived below them in its imperfect, changing, still becoming way. And the mountains were dark and enormous, and the stars were extraordinary, and she felt, precisely and without reservation, that the fire she had kept burning in an empty house had found at last its reason for the keeping. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to its end. If Seraphine's faith and Kelthar's patience and the love that grew between them moved something in you, please leave a comment below and tell me what part of this journey stayed with you most, because those comments are the reason we keep telling stories here. And reading every single one of them is genuinely one of the best parts of running this channel. If you are not subscribed yet, the subscribe button is right there. And every story we tell here is made for exactly the kind of person who just spent this much time. With a tale about faith and forgotten gods and the truth preserved in stone. We will see you in the next one.